Yeshua is here. All right. Well, welcome to Sense Space in studio in London with Matthew Green. This is also the Resonant Man today, the Resonant Men. Here we are, co-creators of the project. So let's have a little introduction, Matthew, and tell me a little bit about who you are and your escapades around the world as a journalist and foreign reporter, and some of what's led you up to this moment of offering this initiative.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Well, in many ways, I'm surprised to find myself sitting here opposite you talking about the Resonant Man. This isn't something that I long planned or imagined myself being engaged with, but has emerged out of a journey of healing and transformation that I've been pursuing consciously now for at least 10 years. And I think I could trace the roots of it back to my teenage years. And I grew up not far from here in southwest London. But really, it's a way for me to integrate a lot of what I've been learning, studying group processes with Thomas Hubel and other teachers, and bring forward some of the transformational energy that I've been tapped into that has really changed my life and how I relate to people, and that I really want to make available to more men.
And it's quite a profound thing as well to go through such a significant transition. A lot of what I talk about in my projects is the liminal web, right? This community of people who are exploring a space between the culture that has been and a culture that has yet to arrive, and a sort of a liminal space, right? And so I feel that your career path also really reflects that. Like, you've really been a part of the world as it is. You've had a successful career as a journalist, you've been an author, you've been in all of these countries in Africa and the Middle East, and yet now there's a call to something very different. And it's also a call to something that, in a sense, like, it doesn't yet exist, and you're kind of creating it as you go with Resonant World, and kind of forging this new space that is only coming into existence, through this kind of channeled creativity, right?
I love the question, Jacob, and you're right. I mean, I started out my career. I mean, I can remember as a teenager, I had a very clear ambition to become a foreign correspondent, as we used to say, and I achieved that. I worked, as you said, across Africa. I worked in Afghanistan, Pakistan. I was embedded with US Marines during the invasion of Iraq. I lived the dream, so to speak, and worked for big global media organizations for many years, published a couple of books, the last one about soldiers, British military veterans finding new ways to heal from war trauma. And so, yes, I was very much embedded in the existing structures, if you like. And for a long time, I found that very rewarding. But there was always a call to something beyond. And a big turning point for me, I would say, was over 10 years ago when I did a 10-day Vipassana retreat in India, which I went to because I was suffering heartbreak, essentially. A relationship had broken down that had been very important to me, and I was looking for healing. And that retreat, I would say, is the pivot point I can chart where I can chart the origin of sitting here today, or the journey that led me to be sitting here today. And of course, since then, I've tried all kinds of other modalities. I'm deeply engaged now in collective and intergenerational trauma healing work, which I think has really revolutionary potential. But you're quite right. I'm now in this liminal zone where I recognize that the future that I want to step into is outside of the institutions that used to sustain me. And it's up to us now to create the path, to lay the track as we go forward. And that's not always easy. I have moments of doubt. I'll be very transparent about that. But at the same time, in these kinds of conversations, I feel something palpable. I feel an intelligence, an animating spirit, if you like, that starts to come alive in a way that is much harder to find in the confines of those big bureaucratic institutions where I used to work. So there's something wanting to come through, and I guess we both feel like we're servants of that. What is your phrase? Radical servants of the happening. I love that. I want that on my business card.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a sense, I feel that we're both riding the same wave, but obviously at different stages in life. I too was called towards more of an institutional path. I wanted to do things the proper way. You know, I went to university, I did my master's degree. I thought I'm going to go and work in a proper think tank and, you know, do media contributions and things like this. But I think the time at which I arrived in that, as for you, was a time in which we were realizing a kind of bankruptcy of the institutional conversation and a failure to really get in touch with the real and get in touch with the depth of change that's occurring in the world today, and also to go down deep enough sufficiently to actually find the resources that we need. So when we talk about heartbreak, you know, being kind of rended open, that is often the starting point for a deeper search. I can speak to my own search through plant medicine, through faith, through philosophy, all of these things, in some sense, born out of heartbreak and being in the valley of the shadow of my own life and searching and needing something deeper, needing like a deeper sustenance. And as it so happens, that deeper sustenance is not really to be found on the BBC or from many of your university professors right now.
Yeah, that's so true. And you're right. I mean, that is so often the way, that it is some profound suffering or breakdown that cracks us open to start to ask these kinds of questions and to draw from a deeper source. And I've certainly been through that myself. I mean, I've had a number of pretty severe episodes of depression which I can see were really the breakdown of almost the false self that I'd constructed, or that had been conditioned or had emerged out of my environment. And there was something more authentic wanting to break through. But often that process is very painful, confusing and overwhelming, but it's also necessary. And obviously the Resonant Man is not necessarily aimed at people who are in the midst of a deep personal crisis, although, you know, if you are, then maybe we can help. But really, the idea is that we are all in a collective process, or a collective dark night of the soul. Like, anyone alive in 2024 is living in a time of upheaval, of uncertainty. There's enormous forces at work which are overshadowing all our lives. And I think the old model when I struggled in the past, one-on-one therapy was the place to go to try and work through these things. And that, you know, there can be definitely a role for that. And my wife is a clinical psychologist, so I know that this is important work. But at the same time, in a collective death rebirth experience, we need to come together to support one another, to hold this. We can't have a relationship with these huge global hyper objects, climate change, authoritarianism, in economic inequality, all these factors which are affecting all of us in some way. We can't hold those alone. So finding ways to come together, to relate in a group context, to really become transparent to each other, to be witnesses for each other's process, that to me is the medicine that we need as individuals, but also that can ripple out and have a bigger impact. That's the work I love. I remember when I read Thomas Hubel's book, Healing Collective Trauma, I think it was in 2020. I just lit up reading it. And I will say, it's not the most accessible book, actually. I would love to write a version of it that's more accessible, but it had the intended impact. It was like an activation. And I always joke with my wife Genevieve, Thomas Hubel, who is the facilitator. He's like, I see him as like Starship Commander. Like, I knew I need to learn from this guy. He's calling me onto the starship. And obviously I've been studying quite intensively with him now for over 3 years. And that's part of this sort of sense of calling. It's like there's something we need to be doing together here. Well, what is it? We're all confused. We're all dazed in some way. Like we're all half asleep actually. But suddenly we get together and we start to wake up, come online, see each other in new ways, discover capacities we didn't know we had. And that's when life starts to get really interesting. And that's what we want to, I think, invite more men into, and women when we do our mixed sessions as well.
Yeah, so this is really speaking to like what is the address of the resonant man in a way. Like in part, it is about a collective transformation, and it's a recognition of the limitations of the therapeutic paradigm, which often honestly is sort of like, well, a friend of yours has problems and you sort of tell them to go to therapy because collectively in our social networks, we don't have the capacity to hold and support one another. We don't have the resources. It's a recognition that that paradigm is kind of a little bit individualistic in a certain sense. And there's something about a shift in culture itself in which we're more readily held on a regular basis by a field of interconnection, a sense of being tapped into something deeper, in which it's not necessarily even that my therapist is going to be healing me or you, Matthew, is going to heal me, but this kind of collective presence, the sense of being tapped into a deeper support, provides that ongoing healing in a way.
Exactly. Like on a very simple level, it is a resource to meet once a week in a kind of consciously created field. And I know this myself because for the last 2 years, or more than 2 years, I think now, I've been meeting with two triad partners. So there's three of us, and in the training with Thomas, we work often in threes. And I've been meeting with the same two women in Germany every week now on a Thursday for over 2 years. And what we've seen in each other's process, how we've changed, how the space between the three of us, and bear in mind, we were complete strangers when we started this, how that space has become an oasis almost for all three of us. We all look forward to that meeting because we know it's a place we can be totally transparent about what's coming up for us, whether that's painful, whether it's joyful, whether it's confusing, embarrassing, like whatever's alive is welcome and will be witnessed. And if we want some feedback or resonance, it'll be given in a very conscious way. And by establishing that little field of just three of us, it's like a kind of island that I look forward to visiting each week, and it energizes me, and I come out of it feeling lighter. And we're, I think, building a similar field on a Sunday evening with the Resonant Men. And it's just so great to have a place like that to rely on, and to know that you can kind of fill up there every 7 days.
I'm feeling tempted to zone in a little bit more deeply on, this principle of resonance itself. Like, what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah.
How does this actually point towards the very fundamentals of life, the very fundamentals of reality? And just to speak to my own experience, resonance to me is about, perhaps most accessibly, a capacity for flow. When I'm creating rap music, when I'm in a dialogue, reaching into that dialogos space where it's really flowing and there's wisdom coming through that's not really of me, Jacob, but I've become a kind of tuning fork for that. That is what brings me the most fulfillment in life. That's where I feel most me, actually, is when I'm in flow. But there's also a sense of being in resonance with something greater than myself. And that is also, in a certain sense, the ultimate resource. It's the ultimate support. It's the ultimate context for one's life. And, as someone whose artistic name is Culture Pilgrim. I've been on this journey, this kind of quest, and I'm still finding out what the pilgrimage is leading me towards. Part of it is about my own relationship to the divine. Part of it is about working out these really tricky questions of how do we come together at that deeper level together. The problem of the collective, the problems of our past religious trauma, and the wounds that we have in relationship to deeper community. But that sense of a deeper resonance can be something that you carry with you foundationally in every single area of your life, in your lonely waking hours, when you might be subject to rumination. That sense of a deeper resonance, that sense of a deeper connection, can actually be the thing that dissolves those pathological thoughts and patterns. It allows you to have more of an abiding sense of peace. And from that place, of course, that's kind of what you bring to connect with others. And then there's a deeper resonance with others, whether they're men participating in this initiative or just every single person that we encounter on the street and in our lives. So this resonance, this kind of technology of being more attuned with oneself, with other people, with the divine, with reality, with nature. This is for me the most important thing that we could possibly focus on. Actually,
yeah, you stated
it's like the opposite of LinkedIn.
Exactly. Come here for
it's actually LinkedIn. Yeah.
It's LinkedIn. Yeah, exactly. And I just love what you've said. And I feel, as you were speaking, I felt the resonance with your words. And I agree with all of that. There's layers of resonance. We can be in resonance with something much greater, and we can use different vocabulary for that, the divine, higher self, source. But there is an acknowledgement of something bigger. We can think about our creative daemon, our creative unconscious, coming into resonance with that part of ourselves in our creative life and our creative flow. And I loved how you were so clear that you're most alive or happiest when you're in that flow, and whether that's through rap or dialogos or the Resonant Man. And I feel similarly, like when I'm in these spaces, I feel I come alive in a different way from a lot of the kind of culturally induced trance that I've spent most of my almost 5 decades staggering around in. I'm like, whoa, hang on, I'm kind of awake now. So, but maybe I could also break it down into a sort of like almost more embodied conversation, or more embodied aspect. Like the way we practice with Thomas, and is a lot of what we do together in the Resonant Man, is just tuning in to where we are in our bodies. What are we physically feeling? Like remembering we're here in a body, especially as men. We can so easily go up into our heads and just get lost in analysis, paralyzed by that, or in a conversation that is kind of potentially quite sterile because it's too much in the head, or it's imbalanced, it's too cognitive or intellectualized. And we remember to keep coming back to the body. Like, what am I feeling? Like when I'm listening to you, or when I'm listening to one of the men, am I feeling them? Am I feeling a resonance? Am I feeling that something in me is responding to their experience? And as we train ourselves, or we practice becoming more aware, more tuned in to our physical body, how that's feeling, our emotional body, what emotions are coming up or not coming up, even becoming aware that we're not feeling is a form of awareness. It's not about one state or other being right or wrong. Even noticing that we're pretty numb is already a big step towards greater resonance. And then we notice what we're thinking. Like, are we focused? Are we listening even? Are we checked out? And as we become more aware of those 3 levels and the quality of the space between us, that's when we start to weave a kind of field. And that is when that is when a kind of intelligence starts to operate that almost orchestrates the space, such that I'll suddenly hear you speaking to my problem, and I'll hear a solution, or I'll hear a level of empathy or I'll feel a sense of empathy with you that I might not encounter anywhere else. And it's that kind of field effect, the resonance that we feel with each other's experience, and the kind of the processes that begin to arise from that can really prove transformative, and which, I mean, we're not promising, like, this isn't a kind of get rich, change your life in 7 days self-help scheme.
That's not the landmark forum.
No, it's not the landmark forum. It's certainly not.
Call everyone in your life right now.
No, it's almost the opposite of that. Yes, we value resonance, and we seek to practice and evoke resonance in the way we've described, but what comes out of that, we just trust, and we don't. There's no preset formula of what we're trying to achieve, and we recognize the value of patience and commitment. These shifts that we want to invite into our lives take time, and we honor that, and that's why we've made a year-long commitment, because we want to have a space that the men can trust will be there for them for the long term. And if you bring your commitment into the space, you will reap the benefits in return. That's my experience.
Yeah, I think that points us towards what we focused in on this week, launching the initiative. This past Sunday, we were focused on developing the field for the authentic future self to actually start to be felt, to actually start to arrive. And that's a really important principle for us, that there is a authentic future self that we can start to sense into in the context of the dialogue together, that we can be tuned into that. And that has a different kind of feeling. It's almost a futuristic, but also deeply intimate sense of oneself. It's like really, really me. But it's also like futuristic.
Yes.
Like alien, almost downloading the alien intelligence, like, of who I am in the future. And that's just one of the dimensions that we're seeking to explore in this. The beauty of the field is that we're developing this kind of vibrant container in which we're going to kind of switch up the focus, switch up the lens, look in different directions at different times. So, there'll be moments for focusing more on worldly purpose, which is very important for men to be connected with. A lot of men struggle with it, but at the same time, we're going to switch. We're going to look at integrity in relationships. We're going to talk about those things that honestly men are so deeply under-resourced in. And personally, in my own journey, was really the thing that called me, I think, to men's work in the very early years of my 20s, was like being in super complex relationship dynamics and not being able to articulate what was going on, not having men around me to share it with, not having the communicational skills to actually kind of ground my relational experiences in a larger context of men, elders, men who've maybe been through some of those things before and can reflect back where I am. Because I might be completely sort of lost or wrapped up in whatever I'm in. And so a lot of this is ultimately fed by like where the culture has failed us, and where we've had to kind of learn and bootstrap ourselves. That's the medicine that we now kind of seek to bring forward for other men.
Yeah, and I love how you've brought this point in as well about the bigger context. And I'm recalling how we first met, which was our mutual friend Daniel Simpson. I think, it was Daniel, who we actually have been in a men's group together with as well a couple of years ago. He sent me something amazing you'd written about ancestral healing and your grandfather in the First World War. And I was on a similar path of exploration of my own ancestral war trauma. And it seemed like just at that very moment, he shared your writing with me, and it felt like a very synchronistic connection. And in my own exploration in men's groups, in the Thomas Hubel work and elsewhere, what has come to me is the degree of frozenness that so many generations carry directly as a result of war, First World War, Second World War, other wars, and how, as a result, the men who came back were just not able, they just had no capacity to relate to their families, to their wives, their children. And we had these huge gaps. We had this lack of attunement, this lack of resonance in these family systems that has cascaded through generations. And I had a very profound experience of really feeling like the frozenness in my own male lineage, with my own dad, with my grandfather. Like, wow, how the lack of the male energy, or the sort of stream of masculine wisdom and vitality, it had kind of slowed down to a trickle. It was still there, but we need to kind of clear the channel and let it flow. And what I feel, one of the principles that I think you were alluding to, is that in a men's group, and we have men of different ages, different generations, quite a wide range actually, we can be as brothers for each other. We can provide what maybe we didn't get from our fathers necessarily, and we can, that to me is a really powerful part of the healing. That through the eyes of other men, witnessing us in our struggles, witnessing us in our triumphs, acknowledging and seeing where we are in our lives, what we're trying to accomplish, that's something that many of us didn't receive from our fathers in the way that our deepest heart would have loved to have done. But we can give it to each other. And by doing that, we're honoring our fathers who maybe lack the capacity because they were so wounded, and they grew up in wounded households, overshadowed by war or all kinds of other collective trauma fields. So we're healing ourselves, but we're actually healing these bigger systems and sending healing back to our ancestors. That's something very real, and there is an element of honoring our ancestors and some ancestral work we already started to touch into in our summer dialogues. So there's that whole component that's also very available. And I love the change of glasses, Jacob. Just want to acknowledge.
Well, one of the
we're moving into a new phase.
One
of
the
dialogue.
fruits of healing is heightened sensitivity to light. Yeah, I think there's an interesting, there's a kind of dynamic reimagining of the warrior that comes in this, because in some sense we need to heal the wounds of the warriors of the past, the absolute horror of war that lives within us as men, the memories, beyond the triumphalism and the heroism and the patriotism and all of the ways that we honor this. There's getting down to the granular reality of what it does to a man's soul, to do violence against another man who is ultimately, another part of the same whole. And so he's losing connection with his own wholeness in the process of that. And in healing that, we become different. And yet we don't want to simply become sort of, I don't know, John Lennon, Imagine all the people, warriors of peace and light. There's a necessity for fortitude. There's a necessity for courage. There's a necessity to speak truth to power in these times. And I think we're both calling that forth. And part of what's afforded us to end up in this position is ultimately the consequence of making the choice to do the slightly risky thing of following what we're called to do again and again and again and again. And that's actually how you come into alignment with your soul, because it's very unlikely to be in following the tracks that are laid out for you by the culture.
I think that is certainly my experience, and honoring that's not always easy. I've definitely struggled with this. I've had doubts on my path. There's no doubt about that. But I also recognize the truth of what you're saying. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here with you in this studio. And I love knowing you, like Jacob. I'm often how did I end up friends with Jacob? We just have this connection that would never have been possible had I been in a corporate environment that wouldn't have allowed me to appear on a podcast, for example. There just wouldn't have been the meeting point for us had I been in that system. Now, there are different paths for different men. I mean, for some men, the path of realization is in those institutions and is in perhaps working to reform those institutions from inside, or using positions in those institutions for particular ends, which are very important. So I'm not making a kind of blanket statement, but I can certainly attest that I've had to kind of bow out of the obvious pathway that I was on to explore, like you say, this liminal zone. And I know that I've kind of reconciled myself to that. I went for a period of wondering whether should I have just stayed with the program? Like, what am I doing? Like, I've definitely had sleepless nights thinking, hang on a minute, like, I wish I was safe and warm in my old life, cozy and sure of myself, with my, prestigious name on my business card telling me how great I am. Yeah, I've had moments of thinking, what have I thrown away? But deep down, the truth is, I know that this is the work that I'm called to be doing. This kind of work, this kind of conversation. This is real. We're so closed, especially as men, so much of the time. We don't even realize it. We don't even realize how alienated from our own emotions we are often. I've been struggling with this myself in the last few days. I'm a father. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I've had to recognize my patterning around how I react when I feel powerless, when my 6-year-old daughter is refusing to go to school or, be on time. Like, the anger that comes through me is not mine. It's something collective, ancestral. It's something quite potent and powerful and scary. And I acknowledge that that's a scary part of myself that I prefer not to admit even exists, but to own it and be real about what is true, which is that we do have these exiled parts that suddenly reassert themselves when we're under stress, when we snap at people, when we act out in all kinds of ways, whether that's getting angry, addiction, kind of devious behavior of whatever kind. There's all kinds of ways as men we can betray ourselves. We need a space to talk about this stuff, to own it, and not with any shame or judgment, but just, this is what's true. This is what's true. I'm struggling. I can be struggling. And the last day I've struggled. But knowing that I have this container and these resources makes the struggle a totally different experience. Doesn't mean there's no struggle, but it means I can engage with it much more consciously and confident that it's not going to consume me or pull me down. And I think we need each other to have that experience, as you said, I think earlier, of being held in a way in this kind of energetic web that just provides each of us with more capacity to come into alignment with that authentic self, who we really are, not this conditioned, reactive, traumatized self, but the authentic self, who we really are, what we've really come to contribute. And then we feel that frequency, and it's like, I'm back.
Yeah. Welcome back. Welcome back.
It's good to be back, I tell you. Yes, this time yesterday I was not. I was gone. I don't know where I was, but I was not. I was gone. So I know what it. I go through this myself.
Yeah. I think it's this gets at really a core metaphysical understanding that guides my life, and I think some of our work. And when I say metaphysics, I really just mean, what are the kind of spiritual laws of reality. We know that there are kind of physical laws governing how things work, but there are also certain spiritual truths to how life unfolds. And for me, one of those is that there is a pedagogical, educational, learning process taking place here. I think it's a poetic truth that our souls are here to learn things. And insofar as we can turn from life is just happening to me, or as a series of random occurrences, to, what is this learning right now? And that's kind of the shift I'm hearing in you. It's not like you've done away with the difficulty. The processes that we're in are the processes we're in. But when we have that educational understanding of reality, and then we ground that in group contexts, now
Yes.
like the shittiest thing
Yeah.
becomes the portal, it becomes the
Yeah.
doorway, because that becomes the alchemical material, that becomes what we bring to the fire, what we bring to the cauldron, and we work with that, and that begins to open up, and suddenly again we can find ourselves going from the most disconnected, or the most lost, or the most trapped in our most core trigger
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then that becomes the doorway to the authentic self.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I love how you stated that. I mean, I sometimes hesitate to kind of engage in my kind of, well, or to share my own metaphysical
Yeah,
belief
alchemist.
system, because there's a part of me that's worried it will be rejected or that it will sound too much. But I believe at the core that it's all a soul curriculum. It's all, everything that's happening is actually us anyway, and it's all working towards our healing. And that obviously can be very hard to hear if you're really struggling with something really deeply painful, that it's somehow supposed to be happening. But this is speaking for myself. I try to approach life with that understanding that, as you say, the core wounds that I carry, and for me, it's things like not feeling good enough or feeling like a failure, kind of the expectation of where I should be relative to where I am, being not being met. You know, there's this kind of, and this anger that I was talking to you about. There's some kind of deep fissure I can feel in my being that needs holding and care, and has had some but needs more. Like I'm aware of these woundings, and you know I still suffer from them. It's not like, oh, it's all transcended and solved, but as you were saying, in the way I work with them in the moment and across time, I I embrace them. I see them as my teaching, my work. These are the fractals of collective patterns that are living in me, that are mine to transmute. And because they're fractals of a collective pattern, I need other people to help me transmute them, because we all carry different fractals. We all have different patterns living in us. We all carry different types of different signatures, different imprints. And part of resonance is often when you may hear a man sharing experience, or the narrative of what happened. The story might be quite different to your story, but the core signature of the experience will land in you, just light up, and you're like, that's what I have. And the relief. I mean, for so many men, we don't even realize that we're not the only ones who are struggling, because there's a lot of spaces where, you know, we have a fun time, we chat, but we don't go much further than the surface, or we kind of, it's very easy to fall into kind of scripted interactions, and that's fine. There's a place for that. But when we recognize that we're just not alone with what can feel so overwhelming that we've been holding, that's the relief. And then that alchemy can start, and the group becomes the alchemical vessel for each of our individual processes, but also a collective process. Like, kind of seeing now the resonant man emerging from the cauldron steam. You know? something more comes through that in turn energizes and enlists each of us in maybe new things, or new projects, maybe new careers, or new ways of relating that we wouldn't have had available to us before. You know, it can be big changes or relatively subtle changes, but they are all serving the unfolding of something more real and something more connected, and something that, and maybe we should talk about this before we close, like, helps us to be in service to other people, friends, family, to women as well. Like, this isn't an enclave for men to kind of hang out with, cling together in defiance of the rest of the world, and kind of closeted from women like monks. That's not it.
No.
It's about being able to actually helping each other to relate to women much more authentically, skillfully, in a spirit of service and honoring and protection, and really honoring and serving that feminine expression. So I don't know whether you want to respond on that.
I want to add courageously
Yeah,
as well to
courageously.
that.
Yes.
Because there's almost, Yeah, there's again with this is always kind of two ends. We're always like in the dialectic of value, the dialectic of masculinity, right? So on the one hand, we are deeply called to cultivate the conditions for integrity in relationship, both in the context of the resonant man with the men, but also in these mixed events that we're doing where we bring women who are part of intentional communities together, and we have this kind of powwow of
Yeah.
getting into it together, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really important. And on the same side, we also recognize like there is a quest for a young man to go out. There is a quest for all men in relationship to women to kind of step out beyond themselves, to be courageous, to be inspired, to be inspired by the feminine. To
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I remember sending you some stat. Was it? I was shocked to read that something like, I don't know, was it 50% of men under the age of 22 had never actually spoken to, I mean, they'd never
I think it was
approached
under 25.
under 25. They'd only ever texted, I mean, kind of approached a woman online, or struck up a friendship with a woman through their phone. Basically, they
Yeah.
hadn't. When I was young, the option did not exist. We had to go and speak to girls, phone up their parents on the landline and say, "Can I speak to you?" And there was an element of, wow, this is scary. This is actually not just scary; it's like life and death terrifying. My whole, I could suffer deep humiliation in this moment, and yet the kind of, and it took my 16-year-old self all the courage he could muster to actually do that stuff. But the idea that that's somehow been lost, and I think I don't know whether that feels like connected to what you're pointing to. It's like, as the younger generation comes up, like how should we be? How should they be in relation to women? Like, what does that look like? And what can we learn intergenerationally about what is right action and right behavior and authentic connection, like really showing up in a good way? Like, these are open questions that, right?
Yeah. I think there's a generosity of realizing that each generation does hold wisdom in this respect, in our kind of progressivist tendency to cultural revolution and always throw out what's been and have the new thing come in. We can lose that. And of course, everybody has a parent or granddad who says things that you're like, well, that's just granddad, that's not appropriate to say anymore. But at the same time, in equal measure, there is wisdom earned through the truth of human experience that we need to receive. And oftentimes you don't necessarily get that from your dad or your granddad, but when you step into this kind of initiatory context, which is to say a deep space where men step out of everyday life and come together multi-generationally, then you can have this kind of super it is this super organism, and that's what's kind of depicted in the artwork behind me. You can kind of see there's this holonic quality. It is its self-enclosed sphere, and then within that there is these centers of light, and that's kind of each man's contribution. But then there's so much interconnectivity between each of those that gives rise to this emergent kind of light in the middle of the resonant man. And this is kind of like this is an evolutionary force. This is also just a collective wisdom that is greater than the sum of all of the men participating. And with humility and with joy, we just love to show up for that, because we've seen it again and again, and it's kind of a fountain of continual insight for us to keep receiving from.
And I love that. And I was thinking, as you were speaking then, I have moments where I look at the screen or in the group in person, and it's like I'm with a group of warriors and we're kind of, deep in a process around something, but it's like we're kind of like fighting men, And then at other times, it's like a bunch of monks writing, or like we're more like monks, men of peace, and we're kind of in that energy. Or another time there'll be a really ancestral quality, like it feels really ancient and like quite primal. Or another moment it might feel like
very feminine.
There's these different kind of energies that you sort of see reflected on the faces around you that kind of emerge at different times in the process, and it connects us with something beyond time as well. There's something there's something transcendent about the space that is outside of our, that is unusual to experience in like going to the pub or to some kind of other kind of typical activity that we tend to do. There's a timeless dimension. There's a quality that is hard to articulate and describe, that can only be experienced, really, that is very enlivening and reassuring and kind of holding in a way. And that I think is what brings me back to the work, is that when the meeting starts, when it's on the screen or in person, there's a kind of, my system knows this. Something deep in my nervous system knows what it means to be in a group of my men, my tribe, my team, who are all rooting for me, and I'm equally in service of them. And it doesn't have the filters that we find in some of the other kind of group contexts that men may have been in at school or in other organizations. There's a kind of a quality of nurturing as well that I just know my system responds to immediately.
Yeah.
Should we say how men watching this who might be interested can get involved?
Have a conversation with us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, here we are. So reach out to us and we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
I think, we're really considering this to be, at least for the first few months, we'll continue to revisit as we go along, but the first few months we're really going to continue to invite men to join. And I think we both have an intuition that we're going to be meeting some resonant men in our travels over the coming months. And there is a degree of selectivity. We do want men who are actually quite inspired by this work, inspired by the potential that we're pointing towards.
Yeah.
And the more they have a sensibility for that, the more readily they're going to tap into the fruits of the work and really deeply benefit. But that's also not an exclusionary.
Yeah, exactly. I think
thing.
What I'm hearing is like we love it when we meet men who just kind of who get it. They're like, yeah, this sounds cool. Like, join the space and make a commitment and see how it evolves. But yeah, if you're feeling the call, drop us a line. Let's have a chat and see if it's a good fit for you, and then we can gradually grow from the call we have.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Jacob. It's been so good to spend some time in person with you.